The air inside the Dela Cruz home was thick with the scent of lechon and burnt candles, the kind of heaviness that clung to the back of your throat like a warning. Manachona's 13th birthday was supposed to be joyous a milestone. Her mother Delna had called Iput from the moment the family gathered around the uneven wooden table. Something felt wrong. The electricity had been flickering all afternoon, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls, as if the house itself was restless. Ronald, the eldest, tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the way his baby sister Geraldine picked at her cake with trembling fingers. Her usual bright eyes, dull and distant. Geraldine, kumain ka, their father Danilo urged, but she only shook her head. Her voice a whisper, lost beneath the cousin's laughter. Hindi kayo, masabi kung, ano ang gagawin? Kayo esa Pilipinas, she murmured, so low Ronald almost missed it. May bahagi, kung nasalung ko. Ronald frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Geraldine didn't answer. Instead, she stared past him, her gaze fixed on the darkened hallway leading to the bedrooms. A chill crawled up Ronald's spine. He followed her line of sight. Nothing there. Just the old family portrait hanging crookedly, the glass slightly cracked over Delna's smiling face. But Geraldine's breath hitched, her small hands nodding in her lap. That night, the celebrations bled into drunken karaoke and clattering dishes, but Geraldine slipped away early, claiming a headache. Ronald found her sitting alone on the back porch, her bare feet dangling above the overgrown grass, the moon casting her in a sickly blue glow. "Can't sleep?" he asked, nudging her shoulder. She didn't look at him. "She's here." "Who?" "The girl in the well." Ronald laughed, but it died in his throat when he saw Geraldine's face pale, her pupils blown wide. Before he could question her, a scream tore through the house. They rushed inside to find Manachona, sobbing in the kitchen, her cake knife clutched in her hand, the blade smeared with something dark. "May tumawag sa akin," she wailed. "Sabi nija, happy birthday, Manichona, parawala, namana kunkusaps." The adults dismissed it as a prank. But Ronald noticed the way Geraldine's lips moved silently, echoing words no one else heard. Later, as the house finally settled into an uneasy quiet, Ronald jolted awake to the sound of scratching not at the door, but inside the walls. He followed the noise to Geraldine's room, where he found her standing rigid at the foot of her bed, facing the cracked closet mirror. Her reflection wasn't hers. A girl with no face, her skin the color of drowned flesh, pressed against the glass. Her hollow mouth forming words that came out in Geraldine's voice. "Happy birthday, Minachona. Salamat saya, Pakalis. Sa Aiken." Geraldine turned slowly, her eyes black as the well outside. "Ronald," she whispered. "Nalims? Puro hindi ako puede. Mama tai. Nang dalawang beses." Then the lights died, and something wet and cold closed around Ronald's wrist. The morning after Manachona's birthday, the house felt different. The air was too still, as if the walls were holding their breath. Ronald woke with a start, his sheets damp with sweat, the echo of Geraldine's voice still coiled in his ears. "Snellimoots." He rubbed his face, trying to shake the dream, or had it been a dream? The marks on his wrist, faint but unmistakable, told him otherwise. For thin lines, like the drag of small, desperate fingers. Downstairs, the family moved in uneasy silence. Delna scraped burnt rice from the pot with too much force, her knuckles white around the spoons. Danilo sat at the table, staring at his coffee like it might hold answers. Geraldine was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Geraldine?" Ronald asked. Delna didn't look up, still sleeping. But Ronald knew that wasn't true. He had checked her room first. The bed was empty, the sheets twisted into knots. The mirror on her closet door was shattered, shards glinting on the floor like teeth. He found her outside, crouched by the old well at the edge of their property. The stones were slick with moss, the wooden cover half rotted through. Geraldine's hands were pressed flat against the crumbling edge, her head tilted as if listening to something deep below. Geraldine. Ronald called. She didn't turn. She's angry, she said, her voice flat. She says we forgot her. Who? Geraldine finally looked at him, and for a second, her eyes weren't hers. They were darker, older. The name sent a cold spike through Ronald's chest. It was familiar, but he couldn't place it like a word on the tip of his tongue, just out of reach. Inside, he tore through the cabinets in the living room, digging for old photo albums. The first few were filled with smiling faces: Manachona's christening, Danello's promotion, holidays at the beach. But in one, tucked behind the others, the pages were stiff with age. He flipped it open, and there, between a picture of Delna, pregnant with Manachona, and a faded shot of Ronald's first day of school, was a gap. A photo had been torn out, only the ragged edges left behind. Looking for something, "Who's Lil?" he asked. Something flickered in his mother's face: fear, guilt, something else before it hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. But Ronald wasn't a child anymore. He saw the way her fingers tightened around her elbows, the way her gaze darted to the empty space in the album. That night, he waited until the house was quiet before slipping back outside. The well loomed in the moonlight, the opening a black maw. He hesitated, then leaned over the edge. "Lilinguna," he whispered. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from the depths, a sound: not water, not wind. A wet, ragged breath. And then, so faint he almost missed it, a voice. "Ronald," it sighed, sang Tagalmo. Behind him, the grass rustled. He turned just in time to see Geraldine standing a few feet away, her nightgown streaked with dirt. Her mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. "Kasama na ako," it said. And then she smiled. The following days passed in a haze of uneasy silence. Geraldine stopped speaking altogether, moving through the house like a ghost haunting its own life. Her footsteps made no sound, her presence barely disturbed the air. But the house itself had grown louder. Ronald first noticed it late at night: a persistent scratching inside the walls, like fingernails dragging across wood. At first he told himself it was rats, but rats didn't whisper. Rats didn't call his name in a voice that sounded like a child crying. His parents pretended not to hear anything. Delna would turn up the radio when the sounds grew too loud, humming hymns under her breath as she cooked. Danilo spent longer hours at work, coming home smelling of sweat and something sour, like fear. Only Manachona seemed to sense it too. She stopped sleeping in her own room, creeping into Ronald's bed each night with wide, frightened eyes. "She's in the walls," Manachona whispered one evening, her small hands clutching Ronald's arm. "She says she wants to play." Ronald peeled back a section of loose wallpaper in the hallway. The plaster beneath was riddled with deep grooves, as if something had been clawing at it from the other side. Some marks were fresh, the edges still crumbling. Others looked years old, darkened with age. Geraldine stood in the doorway, watching him. Her lips moved silently, forming words Ronald couldn't hear. Then she turned and walked to her room, leaving the door open behind her. The scratching grew louder that night, more insistent. Ronald pressed his ear to the wall and heard it not just scratching now, but a voice, thin and desperate. "Tulungan mo ako, Rona." He recoiled. The voice was coming from inside the wall, just inches from his face. "Nakulong ako dito, ang dilim. Ang lamig." Ronald grabbed a kitchen knife and hacked at the plaster until a hole gaped in the wall. Dust billowed out, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something rotten. He shone a flashlight into the darkness. Between the wooden beams, wedged deep in the cavity of the wall, was a small skeletal hand. The bones were tiny, fragile as a child's. Fingers curled as if they had been clawing toward the opening when death took them. Around the wrist hung a rusted bracelet, the metal engraved with a single name, Lilinguna. Behind him, Geraldine let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Hinanap mo saya," she said. "Nayon, makikilela mo na siya." The walls began to bleed. Dark liquid seeped from the cracks, thick and slow, dripping onto the floor in fat, heavy drops. The smell hit Ronald like a fist copper and decay, the stench of something long buried. From somewhere deep in the house, Delna began to scream. The scratching in the walls became pounding, furious, as if a dozen small fists were hammering against the other side. The voice rose with it, no longer a whisper, but a shriek. "He u s t o k o n a l u m a s." Then the lights went out, and something in the darkness grabbed Ronald's arm. The skeletal hand crumbled to dust the moment Ronald touched it. The bracelet clattered to the floor, the name Lilinguna glinting dully in the beam of his flashlight. Geraldine stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth stretched into a smile that showed too many teeth. Stelna's screams had stopped as abruptly as they began. The house was silent again, but the walls still wept. Dark streaks trailed down the plaster like tears, the air thick with the metallic taints of blood. Ronald wiped his hands on his shirt, his skin crawling with the memory of those tiny bones. "We need to leave," he said, grabbing Geraldine's wrist. She didn't resist, but her skin was cold. "Too cold? We can't," she whispered. "She won't let us." Ronald dragged her into the living room where Delna sat, slumped at the table, her face ashen. Danilo was nowhere to be seen. "Who is Lilinguna?" Ronald demanded. Delna flinched at the name. "I don't stop lying." Ronald slammed the bracelet onto the table. "Her bones are in our walls." Her voice is in Geraldine's mouth. "What did you do?" Delna's hands shook as she reached for the bracelet. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, Ronald thought she might finally break. Then her expression hardened. "She was sick," Delna said flatly. "Chiwithal was sick. Weak. The doctor said she wouldn't live past 5. Geraldine made a sound like a choked laugh. Delna ignored her. "We couldn't afford. We didn't have the money for hospitals. One night, she just stopped breathing." Ronald stared at his mother. "You buried her in the walls?" "No." Delna's voice cracked. "We buried her properly. At first. But then the dream started. She kept coming back. She wouldn't stay dead." The admission hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Geraldine tilted her head. "The well," she said softly. Delna's face twisted. "We had no choice." The albulario said it was the only way to keep her from following us. The well was deep, It was supposed to be final. Ronald's stomach turned. He thought of the voice from the darkness, the small, desperate hands that had grabbed him. You drowned her twice. Delna didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The scratching in the walls started again, louder now, more frantic. Something thumped against the front door, once, twice, then fell silent. Geraldine's smile widened. The door burst open. Danilo stumbled inside, his clothes soaked, his skin pale as death. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then Ronald saw the small hand wrapped around his ankles. The fingers blackened and bloated, dragging him back toward the darkness. Delna screamed again. Geraldine laughed. And the well began to overflow. The water came first in slow, creeping tendrils across the floorboards, dark and thick like spilled ink. Then it surged, a sudden rush that knocked Ronald off his feet. He scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the wet wood, his pulse roaring in his ears. Danilo was still screaming, his fingers clawing at the doorframe as the thing from the well dragged him inch by inch into the night. Delna lunged for her husband, her nails digging into his arms, but the water rose to meet her, wrapping around her ankles like greedy hands. She shrieked. As it yanked her down, her head striking the floor with a sickening crack. Blood blossomed in the water, swirling in dark clouds. Geraldine stood perfectly still in the center of the chaos, the water parting around her bare feet. Her eyes were black now, fully black, and when she spoke, the voice that came out was not hers. You left me in the dark, it said. You left me to rot. Ronald grabbed Manachona, hauling her onto the kitchen counter as the water reached his knees. It was cold, so cold it burned. And something moved beneath the surface shapes, brushing against his legs, fingers tangling in his clothes. Stanilos. Screams cut off abruptly. His body went limp, and the thing from the well pulled him through the doorway and into the yard. The water followed, receding as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a floor slick with mud and something else, strands of wet hair. Clumps of algae, the sour stench of stagnant water. Delna groaned, pushing herself up on shaking arms. Her forehead was split open, blood dripping into her eyes. We have to go, she gasped. Now, Ronald didn't argue. He lifted Manachona into his arms and ran for the back door, Delna staggering behind them. Geraldine didn't follow. She stood in the center of the ruined living room, her head tilted, listening to something only she could hear. The yard was a nightmare. The well had overflowed, water gushing over its edges in a ceaseless torrent. The ground was a swamp, the air thick with the stench of decay. And there, kneeling at the well's edge, was Danilo, or what was left of him. His skin was bloated, his mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. His hands moved mechanically, pulling something from the well, a sodden, rotting doll, its yarn, hair matted with algae, its button eyes missing. He turned toward them, his own eyes milky and unseeing, and held the doll out in offering. Parasejo. Then the hands emerged, dozens of them, pale and slick, grasping at the well's edge. A small figure hauled itself up, water streaming from its ragged dress, its hair a tangled curtain over its face. Lilinguna lifted her head. Where her face should have been, there was only a gaping hole. Delna made a sound like a wounded animal. She stumbled forward, her arms outstretched. Anak. Lilinguna moved faster than Ronald could blink. One moment she was at the well, the next she was on Delna, her skeletal fingers closing around her mother's throat. Stelna's scream was cut short as Lilinguna dragged her backward, into the water, into the dark. The well swallowed them both. Silence. Then, from the depths, a single, bubbling laugh. Ronald ran. He clutched Manachona to his chest, his breath tearing at his lungs, his feet slipping in the mud. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. Behind him, Geraldine called out, her voice sweet and sing-song. "Ronald," she said, "you forgot me too." The road stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of cracked asphalt, under the sickly yellow glow of streetlights. Ronald's arms burned from carrying Manachona, her small body trembling against his chest. The night air smelled of wet earth, and something fouler though. Stench clung to their clothes, their skin, as if the well's corruption had seeped into them. They reached the town's edge, where the last bus stop stood empty, its plastic bench cracked with age. Ronald set Manachona down, his hands shaking as he checked his pockets for coins. He had nothing. No wallet, no phone. Only the bracelet, its metal cold against his skin. Manachona stared back the way they'd come, her eyes wide. 8. Geraldine didn't follow, she whispered. Ronald swallowed hard. He'd heard the stories about the old albulario who lived near the cemetery. The one people whispered could speak to the dead. If anyone knew how to stop this, it would be her. The cemetery gates hung crooked on their hinges, the iron rusted through in places. The albulario's hut crouched between two crumbling mausoleums, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of vines. The smell of burning herbs leaked through the cracks in the door. Ronald knocked. The door creaked open to reveal a woman so old she seemed made of parchment. Her milky eyes fixed on Ronald's face, then dropped to the bracelet in his hand. "Ah," she said, "you found her." Inside, the hut was cluttered with jars of murky liquid, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and candles that burned with unnatural blue flames. The albulario motioned for them to sit on the woven mat covering the dirt floor. "Your mother made a bargain," the old woman said, stirring a pot of something thick and dark. The Dwind of the well promised to take the sick child's spirit, to let the family forget their grief. But spirits cannot be irrestonely displaced. Manachona clutched Ronald's arm. "Where's Geraldine?" The albulario's spoons stilled. The well demanded balance. One sister taken, one sister given. Your parents thought they were offering memories. The Dwent took flesh instead. Ronald's stomach turned. Geraldine is not gone. Not yet. The old woman reached into the pot, pulling out a sodden identical to the one Danilo had held. Its yarn, hair was Geraldine's exact shade of brown. Your sister's soul is trapped between. To free her, you must break the pact. How? The albulario pressed the doll into his hands. It was warm, like living flesh. Return to the well. Give it what it was promised. Manachona made a small, frightened noise. What does it want? The old woman smiled, her teeth blackened with betel nut. It wants a sister. Outside, the wind carried the sound of splashing water, though no rain fell. The bracelet burned in Ronald's grip. Somewhere in the dark, something laughed. Was waiting. The walk back to the house felt like moving through a nightmare. The trees lining the road stood unnaturally still, their branches frozen midsway, as if holding their breaths. Ronald carried the doll pressed against his chest, its dampness seeping through his shirt. Manachona clung to his free hand, her small fingers ice-cold, despite the humid night. The house looked wrong. The walls leaned at angles that defied physics, the windows reflecting, not the moonlight, but some deeper darkness. The well stood at the center of the yard, its stones glistening with moisture, though the ground around it was dry and cracked. Geraldine waited by the well's edge. She was perfectly still, her bare feet planted in the dirt, her nightgown hanging limp on her too-thin frame. When she turned to face them, Ronald's breath caught in his throat. Her face was changing. One side remained Geraldine's, the soft cheek, the familiar curve of her jaw. The other side sagged, the skin graying, the eye sinking into the socket. Her mouth twisted between a smile and a grimace, caught between two expressions, two souls. "Ronald," she said, and the voice was wrong. Two voices layered over each other, one Geraldine's, one something older and wetter. "You came back," Manachona whimpered, pressing against Ronald's legs. The doll in his hands twitched. Ronald forced himself forward, each step heavier than the last. The air grew thick, pressing against his skin like invisible hands, trying to push him away. The well's opening gaped before him, a circle of perfect black. "You have to choose, Geraldine." Her mismatched eyes bored into his. "One sister stays. One sister goes." The doll's tiny fingers curled around his thumb. From the well's depths came a sound like 100 children whispering at once. The water stirred, though no wind touched its surface. Shapes moved beneath pale limbs, floating hair, the flash of small teeth. Ronald looked at Geraldine's half-changed face, then at Manachona, trembling behind him. His throat closed. The doll's grip tightened. The well exhaled a breath of rotting flowers. And then the hands emerged not from the well, but from Geraldine herself. They pushed outward from her stomach, her chest, her throat, tiny fingers splitting her skin from within. Her mouth stretched wide, too wide, and the voice that poured out was pure, undiluted, Lilinguna. "You were supposed to save us." The ground beneath them gave way. Ronald grabbed for Manachona as the earth crumbled, as the well's mouth yawned wide to swallow them all. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Geraldine's face finally whole. Finally, at peace as she dissolved into the water. And then the well closed its jaws. Darkness swallowed Ronald whole. The cold hit first, a knife-edged chill that stabbed through his clothes and sank into his bones. Then came the pressure, the crushing weight of water pressing from all sides. He kicked wildly, his lungs burning, his arms flailing through the blackness until his fingers brushed against something solid. Wood, the well's inner walls. He clawed his way upward, his nails splintering against the soaked planks. A gasp tore from his throat as his head broke the surface. Moonlight filtered through the well's opening far above, casting jagged shadows across the water. Manachona was gone. Geraldine was gone. Only the doll remained, floating beside him, its yarn hair fanning out like seaweed. Its button eyes reflected the moonlight, twin silver coins watching him. A sound echoed through the well, not from above, but from below. Something was moving in the depths. Something big. The water trembled. Ronald grabbed the doll. Its fabric squirmed in his grip, suddenly warm, suddenly alive. The stitches along its belly strained as something inside pushed outward. The albalario's words came back to him. Give it what it was promised. He didn't hesitate. Ronald plunged his hand into the doll's stuffing, his fingers closing around something hard and smooth. He pulled it free just as the water beneath him erupted. Lilinguna surged upward, her form monstrous, now a tangle of skeletal limbs and waterlogged flesh. Her gaping mouth, lined with needle teeth, just screamed, a sound that shook the well's walls. Ronald raised the bone. The scream cut off. Lilinguna froze, her hollow eyes fixed on the fragment of herself in his hand. The water stilled. The darkness held its breath. "Take it," Ronald said. His voice didn't shake. "Take what's yours and let her go." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the doll in his other hand twitched. Geraldine's voice, weak but unmistakable, whispered from its stuffed throat. Lilinguna's face twisted. Her clawed hands flexed. The water began to churn. Ronald threw the bone. It struck Lilinguna between the eyes. Well exploded. Water, darkness, and something like laughter roared upward. Swallowing the moonlight, swallowing the night, swallowing Ronald whole. The last thing he felt was the doll's tiny hand gripping his finger. Then silence. Light. Ere Ronald gasped, his body convulsing against solid ground. He was lying in the yard, the morning sun warm on his skin. The well stood intact, its stones dry, its cover firmly in place. The doll lay beside him, its button eyes dull, its stuffing spilled across the grass. Of Geraldine, there was no sign. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Ronald sat up, his heart pounding, and reached for the doll's remains. Its tiny hand opened. Inside lay a single, perfect tooth. And far below, deep in the earth, something began to dig. The house stood empty. Ronald walked through the silent rooms, his footsteps echoing against the bare walls. The furniture was gone, the floors scrubbed clean of the dark stains that had once seeped from the cracks. Only the smell remained, a faint, stubborn hint of damp earth and something sweetly rotten, clinging to the corners no matter how much he cleaned. Manachona had been sent to live with an aunt in the city. The doctors called it shock when she refused to speak, when she woke screaming every night about hands in the dark. Ronald visited when he could, but she never seemed to recognize him. Her eyes would slide past his face, focusing on something just behind him. Her small mouth trembling around words she couldn't utter. The doll's remains were buried at the base of the old santal tree, wrapped in one of Geraldine's dresses. The tooth he kept in his pocket, a tiny, secret weight. At first, he thought that was the end of it. Then, the dreams started. In them, he was standing by the well again, but the water was clear, not black. Something moved beneath the surface, not the twisted thing Lilinguna had become, but a girl. A girl with Geraldine's face, her hair floating around her like smoke. She would press her palms to the underside of the water, her mouth shaping words he couldn't hear. Every morning, he woke with the taste of stagnant water on his tongue. The neighbors began to talk. They said the Dela Cruz house was cursed, that no one should live there after what happened. But Ronald stayed. He had to, because the scratching in the walls had returned. Not the frantic, angry sound from before. This was softer, almost hesitant. A whisper of fingers against wood, a quiet, persistent plea. "Let me in." At night, he would press his hand to the plaster, feeling the faintest tremor of movement on the other side. Sometimes, he swore he heard singing a child's voice, humming a lullaby their mother used to sing. One evening, he found the well uncovered. The stones were wet again, the wooden lid tossed aside. The water inside was still, a perfect black mirror reflecting the moon. Ronald leaned over the edge. His reflection stared back. Then it smiled. Not his smile. Geraldine. Behind him, the house's front door creaked open. A gust of wind carried the scent of rain, and something else, the faint, powdery sweetness of a child's shampoo. Ronald didn't turn around. He already knew what he would see. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent. The water in the well rippled, though there was no wind. And in his pocket, the tooth grew warm. Ronald closed his eyes. When he opened them, Geraldine stood beside him, her small hand slipping into his. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. "You forgot me," she whispered. But this time, her voice was hers, alone. The well waited. The house breathed. And somewhere, deep in the earth, something began to dig its way out.